Hi, Base Gardener here. I want to talk a bit about trauma culture, and the concept of intergenerational trauma, and some of the thoughts that I've had about that of late. So, to start, I think that there is a lot of truth to both of these concepts. I'm a big believer that trauma can shape people's lives in many different ways, and I personally also believe in the concept of intergenerational trauma, not in some kind of mystical way, but just in a direct kind of like cause and effect, where you can kind of trace the path of, significantly harmful incidents, and the effect that that'll have through generations. But I also think that in this day and age, in this era of woke culture, the concept has been applied far too broadly and pushed past its limits in ways that start to make a lot less sense. So to start, I'll talk a bit about my own personal story. Not that I want to get into the details of my family so much, but just to kind of provide an example of how I think this concept of trauma, and specifically intergenerational trauma, is a real concept. So my grandfather was raised in, probably an upper middle class household, but one in which he was subjected to truly horrific abuse. The stories I've heard were that he was locked in a closet sometimes for days on end. So he'd be forced to, you know, pee and poo in his pants, and, wasn't provided adequate nutrition and water and things like that, beaten quite mercilessly and just treated, in a way that I would describe as almost subhuman. Now, I don't know my grandfather very well, probably as a direct result of these experiences that he had. But somehow he managed to take that horrific childhood and forge an actually very successful life. He went on to uh, go to medical school, become a doctor, and he was very successful as a doctor, traveling all over both Canada and doing some international work. And later he got into politics. And actually, he was one of the people who was in support of public health care. And at the time, that was actually a very risky position to take. He had death threats and stuff from, I assume, from other doctors who were, uh, you know, thought that their lunch was on the line. My dad described having a brick thrown through his window when he was a kid. So he did great things despite his challenges in his upbringing. However, he was not able to rid himself of the anger and the violence that he was subjected to as a kid. And so, as a result of that, he beat my father mercilessly. Again, the stories I heard from my father, stories of him being beaten with the brass end of his father's belt, thrown down the stairs, dragged around by his hair. And he wasn't able to change that circumstance until he started taking martial arts. And when he was 15, he was able to best his own father and beat him up and left home at the age of 15. So then you fast forward to me as a child. And although I didn't understand this when I was younger, I can see now that my father made great strides in his own life. He had a rule that he really tried hard to abide by, to never beat me. And although he failed at times and was, somewhat abusive, he really tried hard. And I think, really to his credit, he did a great job at avoiding being a violent person with me. But despite these things, he got in a lot of trouble when he was young, and he spent some time in jail. And, uh, he really always struggled with anger, with addiction, and with eating habits, things like that. And I think as a result, he got very sick quite young, and first was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, mature onset type 1 diabetes, which is quite unique, and then went on to eventually have a major heart attack and bypass surgery, and then cancer is what eventually took him at the age of 58, which again is fairly young. So now I'm a father, and I find that again I'm trying to do a little bit better. I'm trying to work through a bit of that anger and that violence that I also saw as a kid, and I think again I do a bit better with my son. I don't hit my son. But do I always control my temper? Absolutely not. And I provide a negative example that I can see that makes things harder for him and causes him to have issues with anger and regulating his emotions. And try though I may, I am unable to entirely rid myself of that anger and that violence that has passed down through generations. And I want to just make the point that although this is a reality for me, I've seen it much worse in others around me. I have friends who have endured unspeakable horrors when they're young. And I have absolutely no doubt that that will take many generations to work itself through. There may be exceptional circumstances where people are somehow able to be entirely functional and normal despite those kind of circumstances. But I've yet to see it. So I want to give a couple of examples now of historical figures to illustrate what I think about trauma. And so first I'll sum that up. Essentially what I think is that trauma is real, it affects us, it is likely to work itself out in different ways depending on the individual. Some people may be more resilient, or they may express it in ways that we may not notice. They may have nervous tics, they may have compulsions, they may just retreat into their heads. There's a lot of different ways that people work through these things. Um, but at the same time, it does not need to be something that defines us, and it shouldn't limit us in terms of the progress we make in our lives. It will affect us undoubtedly, but I believe that regardless of the trauma that you've experienced, you can do great things with your life. You may need to learn how to ask other people for help, for understanding, for support when things get tough because of that trauma, and we should feel no shame in doing so. But we also shouldn't give people a total pass on their behavior that for that at the same time. For instance, like if people are turning to severe criminality, you know what, you've crossed a red line in my books, and regardless of the trauma you've experienced, if you're visiting severe traumas on other people, you belong in jail. That's my personal opinion. So now a couple of historical examples. Now, one that you may be familiar with is a man named Viktor Frankl. So Viktor Frankl lost quite literally his entire family in a concentration camp of Auschwitz when he was young. And he went on to become a psychologist and a great writer. The book that I've read of his is Man's Search for Meaning. And it's all about turning just, the most extreme trauma that can be visited on a human being and turning that into a way to extract meaning from life and to lead a meaningful life. And that's precisely what he did. And I find that to be a real credit to humanity in general and our ability to be resilient to trauma. The other one is rewinding the clock a lot further, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was born to a wealthy patrician family, but they had fallen on somewhat hard times. So they weren't as wealthy as many of their predecessors, and they didn't live in the same luxury. Um, he lost his father when he was relatively young, and he ended up getting married to a girl who was the daughter of a person who was involved in some very serious civil strife between two rivaling factions. Um, he was affiliated with the Marius faction through this woman, and the other faction, the Sulla faction, uh, wanted him to divorce his wife. He refused, and he went on the run and endured all kinds of crazy traumas trying to stay away from the clutches of Sulla and his henchmen. Getting malaria and having all kinds of other misadventures. He was eventually captured by pirates and ransomed off. And he turned these traumas into ways of just building himself up, making himself stronger. And of course, as we know, he became essentially the first Roman emperor, or nearly so, before his untimely, assassination. I'm a big fan of Julius Caesar, by the way, in many ways, which I may discuss in a subsequent video. But so again, so the reason I think these two figures are great examples is because it doesn't mean just because you've had a traumatic upbringing and you want to do something great that it has to be violent and chaotic, as in the example of Julius Caesar. You can also turn around and do something that's much more peaceful, that causes a great benefit to mankind in general, as in the example of Viktor Frankl. So I think that nuance is important right now when we look at trauma culture and the way it's discussed right now. And if you have any thoughts about that, I'd be curious to hear them. Thanks.